Yeah.
Thank you ever so much. And the next speaker is Andrew Myachykov, who was transferred to this session from the next one. And the topic is visual attention, conceptual accessibility, and structural choices in sentence reduction.
Okay. I don't know whether this thing works.
Do you need the chair?
No, I'm fine. It's much easier to do your job when there were so many nice talks, especially from my own perspective, the ones that show two things that I've learned already, that I'm not the only one who's going to be talking about that. And one thing is that traditional linguistics has repeatedly cast things away from how we understand and produce language that actually are very important and meaningful. For example, pauses or hesitations. And also that linguistic faculty per se and linguistic performance as behavior is not special or not modular as many people believe, that it is related to other more general cognitive phenomena such as attention or memory. So this talk is reporting the research that I have been doing over a number of years with my colleagues at Glasgow Institute of Neuroscience and Psychology, Dominic Thompson, Simon Garrett, and Christoph Scheppers, who's also here and who will deliver a much better talk later. So, and our research in general is motivated by the very general problem of relating language to cognition. When we say cognition, we mean non-linguistic cognition, such as memorial activation or attention control. And there is a very old and very powerful tradition that tends to separate these two and encapsulate them as separate realities. And a famous quote from Chomsky clearly says that ideal speakers should proceed unaffected by things like attentional shifts and interest, for example, or general memory requirements. But there is a growing number of research recently that shows that language is a specific behavior that's right, but this behavior parasitizes or exploits or reuses the parts of architecture that we share with other species, including memory and attention. There is a more focused sort of tradition. I could talk a little more about two ways to look at that. One, very popular line of research, so-called embodiment field or simulated theories of language and cognition interplay. There's also a parallel tradition, probably the most famous author there would be Ray Jackenduff, who emphasizes that these two faculties in human mind and the brain are somehow interfaced. So they're interrelated and they're based on the rules of some regular interface where certain cognitive categories have their counterparts, sometimes as an analog, in language. And whereas Jackenduff talks about language knowledge, language faculty as such, so sort of offline linguistic knowledge, I'm going to be talking about linguistic behavior and more specifically about single sentence production. Right, so let's focus a little better, but before that, it's a very coarse picture of everything is connected to everything. And we have, on the top of that graph, we have sort of non-linguistic stuff, and in the bottom we have linguistic stuff, and they're somehow connected to themselves within the field and between the fields. But I'm going to be interested on these three for the rest of my talk, more so on attention than on memory, and how these are related to syntax. I can predict a question that, of course, memory and attention are also somehow interfaced and that are important co-influences, but I won't be ready to give you an exclusive answer today. Right, and focusing even more on what I'm going to be talking about, as far as sentence production is concerned, I just made a last-minute reference to a very nice talk by Tatiana Cheringovskaya here, who made a reference to linguists believing that there's something special about subject, that subject in hierarchy of syntactic categories has a prominent role, right? So this is the phenomenon in language production that I'm going to be talking about, subject selection, and based on that, structural selection between structural alternatives as a general behavioral response selection during sentence production, which is affected on one hand by reference salience, driven by exogenous visual attention, and or prior knowledge about the reference that becomes subject, which we will call reference accessibility, and I will talk a little more about what psycholinguists refer to when they say reference accessibility. But importantly here, in linguistics, people often use terminology, sort of intuitively use terminology from cognitive psychology, saying that things are focused, or things are prominent, or things are salient, without necessary reference to what it means from cognitive point of view. And we will try to sort of relate these two here. Okay, so imagine that you're describing a very simple, regular event over some time course, like this. So you have a certain person, Prime Minister here, feeding a horse. So you're describing this event to yourself or to your friend, and for that you need to access words. You can access these words, for example, and then use them later in some sort of syntactic structure. However, imagine that this is not such a regular event, and one of these two interacting references here, that is Putin and horse, are slightly different in their salience. So the horse has hat. Okay, so it is very, very likely that this irregularity will attract your attention because it's a very salient attentional cue to the horse. And our working hypothesis here will be that in this case, you will be more likely to start your sentence from the horse, making it the subject, and say something like, the horse is being fed by Putin, which inevitably leads to a binary choice of passive and active and passive voice in English. So that's how the stuff of your mind becomes your sentence. Or, the conclusion here is that reference and focus can, in principle, become subject, which will bias your structural choice during production. It can be a slightly different situation where you describe the same event, same person feeding the same horse. However, you just saw him doing something else. He was fishing. So you have prior knowledge about one of these two references, but not about the other. So it can be Putin fishing, or maybe hunting. Right? So you know all this stuff about one of these two references. And then this reference being higher activated in your working memory can lead to this, where you will focus on Putin when describing this novel event and say Putin is feeding a horse. Well, simply put, highly activated referent here becomes subject, which also can bias syntactic choice. So these two examples set stage for the question I'm going to be asking here. One of the videos here didn't work, so I'll have to play it separately. A very famous study by Ross Tomlin in 1995 looked exactly at how attention can motivate your structural choice in English sentence production. And what he used was a very simple experimental paradigm. Was supposed to play from the PowerPoint. So you see two fish approaching each other, and then finally one fish hits the other. If you notice, red fish received a visual cue, which was a pointer in itself uninformative about whether it's a fish or a horse. But your attention would be directed to the cued fish here, and you would be very likely to say red fish ate the white fish. In the other scenario, when the same two fish approach each other or probably different color, yes, so it's a blue fish and the red fish is cued, and then the red fish gets eaten, and people are very likely to say, do you fancy voice description for this type of event? And say this. So the red fish was eaten by the blue fish. In fact, Tomlin's result was very convincing and extremely robust. In pretty much 100% of cases of each condition, that's what people did. And in order to simplify it and provide a very parsimonious account for what attention does to subject assignment and syntactic choice, Tomlin suggested that, and that's a quote, the grammar merely looks at the event representation directly and maps the current attention detective parameter onto subject. He never claimed it's a universal property, but for English it seems to work pretty good. And other studies followed, including our own, where people tried to use sort of better paradigms in terms of material control and filler usage and all sorts of priming concerns. But inevitably, although effect was slower, about 10 to 20%, but inevitably people found, at least for English, that exogenously driven attentional focus on a reference seems to predict subject assignment quite nicely. Okay. Right, now let's turn to accessibility and related to accessibility memorial activation. Accessibility is a psycholinguistic term which doesn't have direct correspondence, which does have direct correspondence in cognitive psychological literature. First introduced by Bock and Warren, I like to use quotes because people tend to argue about what is accessibility. So in the words of the authors, accessibility is the ease of retrieval of information about the reference from working memory. So in no equivocal terms, the proponents of this terminology say it is a counterpart of working memory activation. Okay, so how can that affect syntactic choice? Well, various properties of the referent have been linked to increasing accessibility. And among these properties are givenness, anonymity, imageability, all other things. They were all shown to improve syntactic choice based on subject assignment. We're going to use a very specific manipulation here that has received less attention, which is referent preview, where before describing your target event, you preview one of the reference, hence increasing accessibility of conceptual information, probably lexical information too, related to it, which was shown to produce the same structural choice, result in sense production and sense verification, and also in recall. There is a very old study that I like very much, and because especially we're going to be using very similar paradigms, which is Prentice 1967, where participants previewed slides like this. These are not real materials because it's an old paper, it doesn't have material examples, so I made up my own based on the descriptions, on verbal descriptions of the material. So you would preview on the prime slide a dog, for example, and then you will see a picture of a man kicking a dog. So by previewing the dog, accessibility status of this reference increases, and this is my slide, but I basically use the results that Prentice reported. The result is very similar to what you find in visual cueing paradigm. If the accessibility of, if the preview increases accessibility of particular reference, it increases probability of including this reference as the subject of upcoming sentence. And people say, in this case, for example, dog is being kicked by a man. But Prentice herself came up with a attentional story for this experiment. So using her interpretation was that by previewing a dog, the dog here, you're more likely to pay attention to it. So she didn't make any reference to a memorial activation story. And you can read that quote that exemplifies or outlines her hesitations with this story, because as she says, we don't know what happens when we preview this reference, whether it only does the attentional work or anything else, including lexical access or conceptual access. And that's exactly what we're going to try and tease apart. Okay, so in this study, we used visual cueing paradigm paired with the reference preview, where after fixating the center of the screen, you will receive the dislocated fixation to ensure your saccade to one of the reference of the target event that is presented subsequently. But before that, you will receive a cue. It's either a visual cue that doesn't tell you anything about any reference in the subsequent target event, or it will be one of the reference presented, which is important, in neutral posture, so that you can't get any thematic prediction, or thematic role prediction about the upcoming event. And the cue here is explicit, so participants have enough time to preview it and to extract information about the reference. Right, so it's a 2x2 design. What we find, and of course, when they receive the target event, they provide a description of it. So what we find is a typical visual cueing effect with more passive voice responses after cueing patient or previewing patient, but importantly with no difference between the two. So the important part of the story here is that we don't get any modulation from reference preview on already established visual cueing effect. However, when we looked at the reaction times, sentence onset latencies here, there was a approaching significance 132 millisecond difference facilitation in reference preview conditions. So in other words, speakers were 132 milliseconds faster to generate their sentences in reference preview condition than in visual cueing condition. So it seems that attention does matter for the choice of structure, for assignment of subject, the choice of structure, but memorial activation seems to do a very different job, which is facilitate the speed of sentence generation, or the ease of sentence generation. Right, but if you add another dimension to this story, which is the power, the relative power of the cue, and what I mean when I say the power of the cue is explicitness, implicitness of the cue. So if you present these two guys, the visual cue or reference preview, for 70 milliseconds instead of 700 milliseconds, this presentation time should not be sufficient for people to extract information about the previewed reference. And from that point of view, these two types of cues should be indifferent, right? Because just like from the red dot, with 70 millisecond exposure, people should not have enough time to differentiate between two types of cues. And if this is correct, the critical condition, the critical difference becomes between this implicit and explicit cue conditions. So what we find in terms of proportion of passive voice sentences is pretty much replication of our cueing effect with more passive voice sentences in patient cued condition. And again, no effective cue type. But interestingly, we see the emergent, a very interesting interaction already that is already noticeable in that plot with proportion of passive voice responses. If you look at that part of the graph, you can see here. So the difference there is the difference for patient use conditions. So it seems that where people do benefit in terms of their categorical choice is when the patients can be previewed for longer, for 700 milliseconds here. So, whereas for canonical structure, this doesn't seem to be important. Also, if you look at the reaction time sentence onset latencies here, we have main effects of cue location with faster sentence onsets when the cue is to the agent, which is a little bit trivial because it cues the canonical starting point for the sentence. There's also the cue duration effect with faster sentence onsets with explicit cues. And importantly, there's an interaction between the cue type, referent or dot, and cue duration, which is on that graph. So the trend that we saw with 132 milliseconds in two slides before that is crystallized here with a significant interaction between exposure to the cue duration, and the type of the cue, whether it's informative or not, whether it's cue or referent. So, and that red sentence in the bottom sort of brings this point to you by suggesting that availability of referential information is important during sentence generation, but it does not affect structural choice. What it does affect is the assembly of the structural choice, which importantly suggests that structural choice and avert generation of the sentence are two distinct processes, and the structural choice is made independent of that. And this is probably the main point that I want to bring across in our general discussion, highlighting that number of studies thus far have replicated that attentional focus on a referent matters during the selection of subject, constituent slot, and the resulting structural choice during sentence production. And this effect slightly changes the function of cue power, such as explicit or implicit cue. Also, an enhanced memorial trace via increase in accessibility of conceptual information, probably lexical information too associated with the reference, does not modulate the structural selection tendency, but it does speed up or facilitate avert sentence generation. And finally, structural decisions seem to be relatively independent of conceptual accessibility and strongly dependent on attentional focus. And the moral activation visual attention seem to provide independent yet important contributions to sentence production process. So for future directions, I just wanted to, there are a number of future directions, and I predict questions that will relate to that. And we're pursuing a number of these. Mind you, we started this research with attentional story in mind, okay? So we wanted to see how increased memorial activation adds up to what we already knew about attention on syntax. That's why, for example, we didn't have another condition where the reference would be presented centrally as it was in Francis' study, right? And that's one important way to proceed. Also, one wonders, so imagine a situation when the preceding context to a critical event is the same, so you have one referent higher activated than the other referent, but then the Q is attached to a new referent, not to the old referent. Then you have a contradicted information from your memorial stream and also from your visual saliency of the reference. That's a good question, what happens then, whether there is any interactions there. Also, I don't know whether I have that slide. Yeah, I do. So you can imagine a situation where both references are pre-activated to a comparable degree, where Putin is riding a horse, in fact, before you describe that sense, and you can add up on top of that all sorts of attention manipulation. So that's another direction that we're pursuing in order to further arrive at a more detailed picture of how attention and memory, visual attention and memory interact during sentence production with regard to structural choice. And thank you very much. Спасибо большое.
Wonderful. You love our Prime Minister.
Yes. Thank you.
So, the floor is open for questions.
Studying from the last pictures that you showed, actually an interesting condition would be also if you had the pictures not, here you show that one is cured and the other is activated, yeah, but then the structure is the same. Putin is doing something with the core.
Yeah.
The second picture is Putin is writing the
I suppose.
I know with the core it is quite difficult, but here...
Yeah, but more funny. I mean, it's funnier that way. Okay.
So that you have not just a picture of one and the same reference is the same semantic role or subjective position.
Yeah, this
Who is
is...
driving who?
Well,
Yeah, well,
I told you that's something reversible. You probably won't find the picture with the horse riding Putin, but you can make a picture that the horse...
Are we safe here, okay? I mean,
Putin is feeding the horse, but it's the horse feeds from...
Yeah, well, you can actually say, I actually had that example in the initial slides with, Putin and horses, where the sentence could be something like, horse is eaten of Putin's hand, right? So it is still possible. Also, here's the thing, so the study right there, if I go back, I don't know how long it's going to take, but it's probably not too long.
Well, joking, but even also these pictures with the dog are not accessible.
Yeah, that's where I'm going. So these materials are not actually from my study. So these materials are from Guyton et al. 2010. So what they did, they didn't only use transitive events in the visual view paradigm. They also used symmetrical events, and also give-receive events. And what they found is an interesting story. So they did find the fact, so you're more likely to, within the complex subject, you're more likely to use the NP for the referent that's cued in symmetrical events. They didn't manipulate other properties because, of course, with Putin and horse, you have humanness versus animacy there too. There's size. So there are all sorts of salient issues. They use a very well-balanced pictures of a man and a woman or a boy and a girl. So it does matter for symmetrical events as well. And there's also a problem of ordering versus structure assignment, but it's a different story, right? That we did research in Russian exactly to look at whether structure and word order can be teased apart with regard to attention. But yeah, it's pretty much the same. And the effect about the same size, by the way. Yeah.
Thank you. Any more questions? Then the coffee break. Thank you ever so much.